and welcome back to the virtual classroom. I'm your host, Dr. Olmsted. And today's topic is the second half of our lecture regarding the Great Depression. So we left off talking about how bad life sucked in the Great Depression, especially if you were black or brown, because the unemployment rate was not 25%, which is the nationwide average. It was 50% for people of color. In addition, we see the tremendous backlash and confrontation in the Southwest as poor whites began the migration from Oklahoma and the plains to California, coming into contact with the traditional bastion of Mexicano migrant laborers. And of course, Anglos complain immediately, they're stealing our jobs. And so while African Americans will indeed face extreme hardship, and again, that's a whole few lectures in and of itself, Mexican and Mexican Americans face something that even African Americans did not: deportation. You see, life was hard for Mexicanos. Let me give you an example. Let's take the story of Martin Morales. As a young man living in Depression-era Texas, Morales recalled that he would stand with his family in a long line, waiting for handouts of food from the local relief agencies. Many weeks, he remembered, the man in charge would demonstrate his racist views toward Mexicanos. You see, when it was his family's turn to step up and receive food, the agent would often refuse to give it to his mother, and instead send them to the back of the line to wait again, having them wait hours until the bread was almost gone or all gone. That's just one example of racism, but it gets worse. You see, not giving them food was one problem, but taking care of this whole issue of job stealing was another. Take Secretary of Labor William Doak. Now, Doak proposed that one way to provide work for unemployed Americans was to oust any alien holding a job and deport them. He publicized that there were at least 400,000 undocumented illegal aliens, and at least 100,000 could be deported. And so from 1930 to 1935, the United States initiated a coerced, voluntary repatriation program to send as many Spanish speakers back to Mexico rather than provide them with aid, often whether they were U.S. citizens or not. They touted that, quote, deportable aliens include Mexicans, Japanese, Chinese, and others, unquote. But in reality, it was very selective enforcement. While publicly stating they were not singling any specific group out. For example, when they raided in El Monte, of the 13 jailed, 12 were Mexican. It was very clear who was being targeted here. In fact, in places like Los Angeles, it was common to have police roundups where the police would just rush into a common Mexican gathering place and immediately ask everyone there for proof of identification. And if it was not readily available, these so-called Mexicans would be jailed until it could be proven. Or some other times they would just put them on a train out of the city and dump them at the border. Let me give you an example of this. What was called the La Placita raid. The La Placita Park was a vibrant cultural hub in an immigrant neighborhood, a place to listen to music, talk politics, and socialize. According to historian Doug Monry, he says, quote, in the days before television and radio, if you wanted stimulation and excitement, you went to La Placita, unquote. On a sunny afternoon, February 26, 1931, the park was full of close to 400 people when suddenly, without warning, immigration agents sealed off all the exits. Some were in military olive uniforms, others in plain clothes, wielding guns and batons. The agents immediately demanded that everyone in the park line up and show their papers. Some of the officers would take those papers and just put it in their pockets and then hold the Mexicanos for days in containment cells. Their families were not notified. They did not know where they were or if they'd been deported. They would arrest dozens and deport many. But the greatest impact was psychological, as it instilled fear into the Mexican American community. The threat of unemployment, deportation, and loss of relief payments led tens of thousands of people to leave the United States. Places like Chicago and Detroit became central hubs of deportation for Mexican and Mexican Americans. These campaigns were swift and effective. They would raid homes and businesses that occurred all over the country. They would break up families. Anyone who resisted would be arrested. Vigilante groups were formed and acted out their frustrations on Mexican American communities. Entire communities were under attack. Businesses closed. They were denied access to schools and hospitals. They could find no help among law enforcement. All Mexicanos, whether citizen or not, looked alike to immigration officials. In street sweeps throughout the nation, in many of our nation's major cities, anyone who looked Mexican found themselves at serious risk of being picked up and taken into custody. It was act first and ask questions later seemed to be the policy of immigration services. Arrests were made without warrants or even probable cause. As one radio announcer in Southern California, Jose David Orozco, recalled, quote, "Women were crying in the streets when not finding their husbands," unquote. The immigration agents exercised almost total control of the process. Deportation procedures were made to order for wholesale violation of human rights. Mass arrests were conducted without benefit of warrants. There was no opportunity for bail. Deportees languished in jail until the next deportation train was formed. These procedures were the norm rather than the exception to the 1930s. It was common for local agencies to tell Mexicanos that they should just go back to Mexico, wait a while, few years, for the economy to get better, and then they could return. But this was a lie. You have to realize they're leaving due to being destitute, right? They're being rounded up and convinced to leave because they're suffering. They have no job. They're seeking services or handouts from the city, which means that if they try to re-enter in a few years, immigration at the border will view them as liable to become a public charge. Or because they left due to being destitute, if they try to re-enter, these immigration officials will use the LPC clause and say, well, you were poor and then begging before, why won't you do it again? Of course you will. And so the vast majority will be refused re-entry. Now, again, there are a few examples of Mexicanos being able to re-enter in future years, though it largely depends on if they had a family member still in the U.S. who could have a job waiting for them. For example, Vincent Pardo, resident of Saginaw, Michigan. He was repatriated. He voluntarily did it, but was able to re-enter when his maternal grandfather was able to get Vincent a job at the Saginaw Foundry. So there are examples of it, but by and large, if you took repatriation, either voluntary or forced, you would not be able to re-enter the country. Others would realize the lie and stay, For example, Rafael Arcello, we'll talk about him in a future lecture regarding the sit-down strike. He began living in Flint, Michigan in the 1920s. And his son described to me how hard life was in the 20s and 30s. In fact, his son described how his father would talk about the 1930s and talk about how he was convinced that he should go back to Mexico. Hearing that you'd be given a card to re-enter the United States in 5 years. But his wife, Fermina, wrote to her suegro, her father-in-law, who was still in Mexico, seeking to dissuade her husband from leaving Michigan. And Rafael's father wrote back saying, quote, "If you think you're poor in Los Estados Unidos, what makes you think you'll be any richer in Mexico? You tell that son of mine for him to stay there. I do not want to see him because you will be worse off than you are in the United States," unquote. And see, so for Rafael Arcello and his family, his father was able to talk some sense into him through a letter and say, no, you don't understand. You think things are bad in the United States? Things are far worse in Mexico. The Depression was not just a U.S. phenomenon. It was global. And so some would leave, some were forcibly left, some were rounded up, some would believe the lie, some would not. But all told, scholars estimate that approximately 1 million people of Mexican descent were part of this repatriation. I'm going to repeat this. Scholars estimate that nearly 1 million people of Mexican descent were repatriated, shipped across the border to Mexico. But of that 1 million, nearly 60% were U.S. citizens, born or naturalized. So of that 1 million people, 600,000 people who were deported were U.S. citizens, just because they were of Spanish-speaking descent. Now, let's be very clear. That number's terrible. It's a blight on the United States history. It's embarrassing. Now, understand though, many of those citizens were likely children who were born in the United States while their parents were still Mexican citizens. And so therefore, they didn't want to break up their family. So when the parents were deported or repatriated or chose to leave, they took the kids with them for obvious reasons. Otherwise, the kids would be left in the orphanages and in destitution. But that really shouldn't matter. It's still a fact that the United States deported 600,000 U.S. citizens in violation of their basic citizenship rights. The underlying significance of this problem was that the Bureau of the County's Welfare believed that even though these children were American born, culturally they were Mexican. By thus mixing nationality and culture, or confusing nationality and culture. Places like Los Angeles County, where many Anglo-American, as well as many Anglo-Americans across the country, across the Southwest especially, excluded from its mind the thought that Mexican-American children might someday become productive U.S. American adult citizens. By deporting 600,000 U.S. citizens, most of whom were children, They're conflating this idea of nationality and culture. Yes, they may be culturally more Mexican rather than American, but they're conflating this idea of nationality and culture, excluding from their mindset that these kids would grow up to be productive members of U.S. society, citizens, as adults. And so ultimately, the intent of repatriation was threefold. Number one, to return so-called indigent nationals to their own country, in this case, to Mexico. Number two, to save welfare agencies money. So rather than help them and pay for them and use the money to help citizens, deport them. And of course, number three, so-called to create jobs for real Americans. And so having their hard-earned tax dollars used to support supposedly indolent aliens did not sit well with property owners and business interests. Their rancor was further incensed by the knowledge that very few of these so-called Mexican immigrants would ever renounce their allegiance to Mexico and become fully 100% American citizens. And as such, they were seen as ingrates who were deemed unworthy of receiving public benefits. And then in addition, they were told that Mexico had a plan for them. This was promoted by the Mexican consuls and even Diego Rivera himself, who was in Detroit painting the mural at the Detroit Institute of Arts. Indeed, under pressure, the Mexican government did welcome repatriated nationals back, hoping the skills they returned with would help Mexico recover from the Depression more quickly. It didn't. It only exacerbated the Depression with more mouths to feed. The reality is, in Mexico, life was even worse. See, Mexican immigrants had changed during their time in the United States, and a form of estrangement had quietly occurred. Although these now repatriated Mexicans enthusiastically celebrated events like Las Fiestas Patrias, and they listened to mariachi music, and they ate Mexican food, a new dimension had been added. They had become agringadas, or Americanized in many ways. Their mode of life, their style of dress, their speech patterns, their manners, they all now assumed an American flavor. Tex-Mex and Calo, a mixture of Spanish and English, were fused into new speech patterns. No aspect of life had escaped the dominant American influence. Sunday comics, Hollywood movies, popular radio programs, daily soap operas had left an indelible mark. Is it any wonder that even the adult repatriates felt as if they were returning to a foreign country? The average Mexican family returning to Mexico consisted of 5 persons. In most instances, 3 were children. Repatriation thus created a new and distinct group known as immigrants. For the children born in the United States, the Mexico they were returning to was a foreign country, literally. They were U.S. citizens. And while it was the land of their parents and ancestors, it was not their home. Especially for daughters-in-law who had grown up in the American ways. They were considered as being too independent, too strong-willed. Especially in rural areas, they were often viewed as free thinkers by women who were accustomed to more traditional and cloistered ways. Their behaviors seemed to be brazen and unbecoming of decent women. Some of their criticism was undoubtedly due to envy and jealousy. American hairstyles, American modes of dress, use of makeup, and personal deportment were all aspects that contributed to resentment and ill feelings. Preparation of meals was also a great cause of friction or open conflict between mothers and daughters-in-law. The children were hampered by a lack of fluency in Spanish. And for young people, it was especially tenuous. As while they had little in the United States, when they found that they returned with some American goods like radios or automobiles, they found that they were, quote, too American to be Mexican, but too Mexican to be American. The U.S. kicked them out, and in Mexico, they also did not fit in because of their cultural differences. And note, again, be clear, Mexicanos were not the only ones deported, but they were the most targeted. During the period from 1930 to 1939, Mexicans constituted 46% of all people deported from the United States, even though Mexicans or Mexicanos comprised less than 1% of the total U.S. population. Let me repeat that. So Mexican and Mexican Americans comprised or consisted of less than 1% of the total U.S. population. But yet they constituted over 46%, almost half of all people deported. This is a disproportionate number. The massive deportation dragnet struck terror into the Mexicano communities across the nation. And since the immigration services were housed within the Department of Labor, it must be surmised that this immigration service had a vested interest in getting rid of as many Mexican people as possible. Because the deportation of more Mexicans meant more jobs for quote unquote real Americans. Now, please note, while the main years of the repatriation lasted until 1935, which means it would continue under the next president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. However, it is also true that under FDR, life in the United States would get better, thanks in part to his New Deal to deal with the Great Depression, a topic for next time. So until then, take care and bye-bye.